there is a manpower problem on the Russian side. It's a quality problem. So, there are a lot of people fighting there who are physically ill. Tuberculosis is apparently rampant on the Russian side. There are, people with criminal convictions. This is not, sort of high quality soldiery.
Hi, welcome to Superpowers, the future of global security here on Times Radio. I'm James Heappey, and this week we are joined by John Lough, who is the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. John, welcome. It's timely that you should join us this week because we're recording this on Monday, the 17th of November, which is the day that President Zelensky heads to Paris, I think for his 9th visit. And it's been really interesting to see the journey that these visits have been on. And it feels like this one is back to the good old days of Zelensky seeking military support rather than talking around a peace deal and trying to garner diplomatic support in Washington. What's your take?
Yeah, I think, James, first of all, it's very good to be back with the Times Radio audience. I think your initial analysis is absolutely correct. Zelensky is looking for weaponry. The fact that Ukraine is under this degree of air assault by the Russians at the moment is really very disturbing. Putin has decided that, he told Trump recently that, if we can't agree a deal, then, I'll destroy Ukraine. And he's going about that pretty systematically because the number of attacks on energy assets, the critical infrastructure, is growing rapidly. And Ukraine clearly has a problem here because they don't have enough of these interceptor missiles of the kind that will shoot down the ballistic missiles coming for Russia, because those are the ones that are really doing the damage. So there's a gap to be filled there. President Zelensky is trying to source an extra 25 Patriot systems, which are among the most effective for this purpose. But he has really no chance of getting his hands on that sort of number, during this winter. But anything he can do to bolster the air defenses at the moment will help. And the Russians' goal here, of course, is to demoralize the population to such a degree that Ukraine will lose the will to fight. I think that's very unlikely to happen. But that said, this winter is going to be really extremely tough. And we can already tell that from the extent of the power outages in the major cities, including Kiev recently, where they've had the power off for maybe 12 or 16 hours a day. But the towns and cities that are taking the brunt of the assault at the moment are really in the east of the country. And they're not, in some cases, as well defended as Kiev. And the concern is that we're going to see more internally displaced people, or in fact more people leaving the country. And that, of course, puts the Ukrainian system under additional stress.
And a level of stress that is unsurvivable? Will we see political pressure build on Zelensky for anything other than to continue the fight?
We don't see that yet. And I think the reason is that a majority of Ukrainians still understands that they have to keep fighting, because if they don't, the country's independence is in jeopardy. And to some extent, the fact that this war is escalating into the skies reflects the fact that they have, to a large degree, blocked the Russians on the ground in Donbass. And the Russians are advancing, but at a real snail's pace, and they may continue to do so. But Ukraine is also, and we mustn't forget this, is taking the fight to Russia in the skies, because they've been attacking Russian oil industry infrastructure, particularly oil refineries, to some effect. It's definitely not negligible what they're doing. And we've seen for various reasons, the price of petrol, for example, in Russia in October went up over 10%. We know that there are some sort of short-term problems because these refineries being hit with some regularity. The Russians don't seem to be able to defend them that well at the moment. This is causing a degree of local problems, a number of local problems. The level of production of oil products, particularly petrol and kerosene and things, has fallen. So the Russians have had to import some of these. Of course, what they don't process as product, they're then able to export as crude oil. And here is still a problem because the Russian state budget is still earning from those exports, of course. So this puts really a premium on trying to close down at least some of these channels that the Russians are currently using to sell oil to China and India in particular. But here again, the United States and its allies really don't have I think, the sort of motivation that they had in the case of Iran back in 2012 when they took off the global market. I think well over 60% of Iran's oil exports. If we were to do something similar with Russia, it would lead to a pretty appreciable spike in the oil price. And of course, that's the one thing that no Western leader wants. In fact, President Trump has said quite recently he was optimistic they were going to get the price of gasoline in the US down to $2 a gallon. So, I mean, that gives you an idea of just how sensitive this is. So I think in many ways the Kremlin feels that it's sort of sitting pretty at the moment. And Putin continues to think that it's just a matter of time and he'll roll over the Ukrainians. They'll just give up fighting. Everything he thinks, or he says publicly at least, is on his side. They have, he says they hold a strategic initiative across the entire front. And of course, they do have superiority in terms of numbers and weapon systems. But the Ukrainians, it seems to me, are more motivated to fight. They've made remarkable use of drone technologies to compensate for their lack of personnel. So they're still in the fight. So Putin's been saying this for over a year now, and you then have to ask, well, why haven't they achieved this breakthrough? And they don't really show any sign of doing it yet. They're likely to take this mining town of Pakrovsk in Donbass. I think it's surrounded on all sides, and they've infiltrated into a large part of the city. So that can be expected to fall as a neighboring town that will fall as well. But that will not be a disastrous outcome for the Ukrainians because they've got defense lines behind that. But still, the Russians have this determination to continue. They have the numbers. And I think it's still a question of how long Ukraine can go on fighting with this intensity. I think personally they'll go on for much longer than anybody expects, simply because who would have thought nearly 4 years ago when this war started that they would still be in the fight.
Yeah, I think I share that view. The last 4 years gives us every reason not to think we understand the Ukrainian resolve or the Ukrainians' ability to hold this vast Russian military machine at bay. They've proven themselves to be adept, but at some point, just the realities of their economy and their military limitations will catch up with them. And so I wonder what Zelensky should be saying to Macron today. He's obviously going to ask for more air defence. He's going to just seek, I suspect, to re-embolden the EU through Macron in its resolve to support Ukraine. But is this with a view to delaying the Russians yet further? Is anybody talking about a Ukrainian ability to launch counteroffensives in 2026 or even 2027?
No, I think that's off the agenda for the moment. And this reflects the fact that, the Ukrainians tried their counteroffensive in 23 and then to some degree in 24. And remember the incursion into Kursk region in 2024, which is a kind of sort of shock and awe operation. And there are questions about was that actually really worth the effort and the manpower loss? I mean, I think it had quite an effect on the Russians at the time because it just showed how, in some respects, how weak they were and how they concentrated their forces in one particular area. So the Ukrainians, I think, are frustrated at the moment that at least some of the Western allies don't seem to appreciate just how urgent this situation is. And that if Ukraine were, in the worst case, to suffer a defeat, how damaging this would be for European security as a whole. And those countries at the moment that feel that they're sort of distanced from this war would probably suddenly feel a lot closer to it because the instability that would be generated in Ukraine, because this war would not just be over in a flash. Insurgencies would continue. You could expect refugee flows you could expect probably more things to spill over the borders, and then that's going to affect, Europe in a different way. So I think this is what the Ukrainians are very frustrated about, that, they feel that the Western allies generally have given them just enough to keep fighting in the hope that sanctions will disable the Russian economy and persuade Putin he has no option other than to negotiate. Now, we've talked a lot just about how resilient Ukraine has been during this war, but we have to appreciate also that the Russians have had a lot of built-in, I would say, resilience, particularly in the economy. So, this threat of the mother of all sanctions, and the European Union's now on to its 20th package of sanctions. And the Russian economy is certainly hurting in some ways. But I think the general view among Russian economists is that they can go on fighting like this for some years. So how do you change the equation? And I think possibly the only way you can do that is to demonstrate to the Russians that they're actually not making progress to the point where more people, perhaps in Putin's entourage or in the Russian elite, raise the question of why are we doing this? Why are we, weakening the country's long-term interests? Why are we making ourselves, at best, a junior partner of China, but ultimately, in the worst case, possibly even a vassal state? I mean, those sort of bigger questions are out there, but they haven't acquired a critical mass at this stage.
So I want to come back to both the so what for Europe and the so what for Russia and the wider world. But my very distant memory of being a junior officer in the British Army is that a really important principle of defence is offensive spirit. And I worry very much that if the plan, be it the Ukrainians' plan or a plan imposed on them through lukewarm support by the donor community, is to just make the Russians work ever harder for every mile that they take, in the hope that you grind them to a standstill and eventually they give up. But it's an entirely defensive effort that in itself is very challenging because it completely lacks offensive spirit. And then secondly, that strategy only works if towns that are inevitably to be lost as the Russians inch forward don't become totemic for the Ukrainian effort. And we saw it with Avika, we Rissing, with Pokrovsk, because the fight for these places goes on for so long, they become emotionally significant even if they have no tactical or operational value. And if your plan is just to absorb the Russian effort and grind them down over months and months and months and make their casualty rates go even higher, the cost of their economy be even greater, so eventually they give up, you've got to be willing to, without sentiment, cede the ground when the inevitable moment comes. And I just worry that on both fronts the Ukrainians aren't quite doing that.
I think you're right. The Ukrainians are, in both respects, at a disadvantage. But I mean, let's just question your point about the offensive capability, offensive spirit. The Ukrainians have been taking the fight to the Russians in the sense that they found a way of striking deep into the Russian rear, of hitting energy infrastructure, for example. You think of that extraordinary operation that they conducted that targeted the Russian strategic bomber fleet. I mean, I think for Ukrainian morale, that was extraordinarily important. And it also showed to the Western allies that, Ukraine's still in this game. They may be fighting with one arm tied behind their back, but they have capabilities that can really achieve impact and upset the Russians, because I think that was so deeply embarrassing for the Russian Air Force. So we're likely to see some more, I would say, operations of that kind. Whether they'll be as spectacular is another question, but I think the Ukrainian ingenuity here is absolutely remarkable. As far as the loss of these towns is concerned, I mean, I think you're correct when you say that Pokrovsk is still seen as an important logistical hub because of the railway network there. But it's lost a good deal of its importance because the Ukrainians have moved their logistics elsewhere. But we're going to see over the coming weeks and months much more mention of other towns like Slovyansk, Kramatorsk, Konstantinovka, that are kind of not so much in the sort of Western media lexicon at the moment, but those are going to be the agglomerations that the Russians go for next. And I think Putin's goal is to, in fairly short order, take in complete control of Donetsk region. And then, maybe try to demonstrate to President Trump that, we need to talk again. Putin will only deal with Trump. And for the moment, Trump appears frustrated. He's possibly lost interest because he thinks that Putin didn't negotiate with him in good faith. He embarrassed him. He invited him to Alaska, quite literally rolled out the red carpet, invested huge political capital in that meeting. And Putin didn't play ball. Now, there are questions about why that happened, but fundamentally it seems that the special envoy, Steve Witkoff, who had been sent to Moscow beforehand, misunderstood what the Russians had told him and thought there were some signs of flexibility. So the fact that that channel for the moment has gone dead, I doesn't mean to say it can't be reactivated, means that I think Putin thinks, well, I've got no option but to continue fighting and demonstrating that Trump at some point needs to come to the table. So we're set for I think a really difficult few months because there's no sign even of a meeting between Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, and Sergei Lavrov, the Foreign Minister, which will be the obvious place to start preparing a summit meeting. So that's kind of been postponed indefinitely. But I do share your view that if more towns fall, if the Ukrainians, for example, can't withdraw in an orderly fashion, this is going to raise questions about the competence of the military command, the whole purpose of the war. But the general feeling I have, just looking at what the Ukrainians are saying and writing, is that they are still determined to continue this war. And they see absolutely no option. And it's not something the Russians can, win quickly. And they know that the casualty rates on the Russian side, I mean, the number of killed in action over the last 3 months have risen. So there is a manpower problem on the Russian side. It's a quality problem. So, there are a lot of people fighting there who are physically ill. Tuberculosis is apparently rampant on the Russian side. There are people with criminal convictions. That this is not sort of high quality soldiery. Now, it doesn't mean to say Ukraine doesn't have its own problems. Its problems are simply numbers, but it's trying to compensate for that using technology. And we tend to think of the front line being a little bit like the First World War, just very long lines of people in trenches. In actual fact, it's very sparsely populated. In fact, on both sides. But the Russians are able to concentrate numbers in certain places and move forward through this so-called kill zone where the drones operate, when the weather is good, and just in very, very small detachments. And I've seen images of them driving on buggies, in converted larders, you name it. Not the sort of things that you, James, would have been acquainted with, I think, as a British soldier.
It is a fascinating subject, and I've been to a whole load of events recently where people have been trying to unpick what are the actual lessons to learn from this war. To what degree are they peculiarities of Russia versus Ukraine in that geography, given their start states and where they're at now and their economies and everything else, versus the degree to which this is the vision of future warfare. I think there's an awful lot of people that are trying to learn the lesson that is most conducive to whatever they're trying to sell NATO governments at the moment. And some slightly more sort of cool-headed analysis is welcome. John, can I get you to zoom out a bit? You mentioned 5 minutes or so ago the and I agree with you, the lack of understanding in European capitals about just how desperate Ukraine failure would be, and that it's not just Russia achieving an objective and then everything snaps back to normal. It would bring with it a really expensive and really dangerous future for the EU. Can you just expand on that?
Yes, I mean, if we look at this, scenario of the defeat of Ukraine, we're going to have a country that is politically and economically probably in a chaotic state for a good long while. The Russians will be looking to consolidate control of those areas that they occupy, probably looking to install some sort of regime friendly to them. So you could see, potential for some sort of low intensity conflict, just, ravaging the country. Then you would have, I think, a high degree of disagreement within Europe about how to deal with this, because it would not be an orderly situation. This in turn would impact the consensus within NATO, and I think the whole capacity of NATO to continue functioning as an organization. And one can debate the extent to which it is still capable of effective operations, given the ambivalent attitude of Washington to, I think, its NATO commitments. So you could see, a recipe for some widespread disorder, breakdown of institutions. And how would the European Union function, in these conditions? So I think there are probably a whole set of questions there that policymakers don't really want to have to think about, let alone, air publicly with their voters. So I think that is really concerning. And let's remember that Ukraine is a big country, and if we were to see, let's say, another, I don't know, 8 to 10 million people leave, where would they go? What would they take with them?
So the thing that is interesting is I have heard over the last 3 years, I've been in the room when sometimes these speeches have been given, and I've heard von der Leyen, Tusk, Merz, Macron, Rutte, all give exactly that message about the fact that better to see the Russians defeated in Ukraine than have them on the EU and NATO's doorstep with a battle-hardened military and a belief that they can just take back whatever they consider to be theirs. And that is a really expensive, really destabilizing, really challenging future for the EU and NATO to have to deal with, especially when the United States is ever more focused on China and the Pacific. And yet, whilst European defence industry has mobilised and is producing at a higher rate than it was 3 or 4 years ago, still not at the scale that you would have expected. And the level of gifting to the Ukrainians has plateaued. It's a long time, I think, since we went through a really significant capability threshold. Tomahawks would have been a big moment, but Trump has declined. The Germans are still refusing to give Taurus. The UK and France are replenishing their Scalp and Storm Shadow stockpiles to recover their own sovereign capability. There's no significant gifting program. So the narrative that you've just set out, that many European leaders seem aware of, just still isn't being matched by economic and industrial activity and then gifting.
No, it's not. I mean, we can see in Germany the first signs of a serious rearmament program, which to me suggests the Germans have really woken up and smelt the coffee, because these are things that are almost unimaginable. But in terms of European defence industry, clicking into gear and producing weapons in the quantities that now would, assist Ukraine and replenish, those stocks that we've emptied, in fact, to supply Ukraine, we're just nowhere near that. And there are concerns now that because of there's been a change of government in the Czech Republic, the Czechs played a very important role in coordinating the supply of artillery ammunition to Ukraine, that they may not be able to sustain that. It's not quite clear how that's going to sort of play out, whether somebody else can take responsibility for that. So you will remember very well at the outset of the war the commitment by Ursula von der Leyen and many, many other European leaders that we're with Ukraine as long as it takes. I hear that a bit less now. And I also know that Ukraine this year is going to need, in terms of financial support to keep the country, the economy going, something in the order of $60 billion, possibly more. So where's that going to come from? Well, one obvious source, and it's been talked about a great deal, is the Russian frozen assets that we have in Europe. What's that, 250 billion, something like that, euros. And the EU members have debated this at great length. The Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, has come up with a quite sort of cunning plan to avoid all the legal issues, or the majority of them would be associated with, in fact, using some of those funds, in fact, to prop up the Ukrainian economy. But we go from summit to summit, and the leaders still can't agree. So, at some point, we are going to collide with reality here, and have to accept that if we don't take these more radical steps, then the Ukrainians are going to lose this war. And it's as simple as that. And this is what Putin senses, that Europe doesn't have the courage of its convictions, that it's too divided, has too many other problems going on, and I think the Russians pay some attention at the moment to what's going on in Britain, for example, because Britain has been one of the most outspoken supporters of Ukraine, and I believe has done a lot of very positive things for Ukraine, is extremely well perceived there, justifiably. And yet internally, domestically, we have obviously very severe economic constraints. And politically, we may be moving into a period that becomes more turbulent. So they take that as evidence that the Western countries talk a great game, but they don't have the commitment to see this through, and that Russia has the commitment. Because for Putin, at the end of the day, this is existential. He cannot lose this war, and he has to demonstrate to the Russian elite that this was really worth the effort, that his personal obsession, and it is a personal obsession, hasn't led the country down a catastrophic path, that this will all come good in the end. But I think at the moment he's struggling to do that, because who could possibly have believed that he'd be going into a fifth year of this war? Interestingly, Donald Trump has even picked up on this, and I think to some extent he may, much as he may in some respects still admire Putin, the thought has entered his mind that this guy actually might be a loser, because he should have won this war in a couple of weeks, and he is absolutely right. So how does he sort of rationalize that? Maybe his sort of bromance with Putin is off the boil now. We shall have to see.
What about the wider cost to Putin? You mentioned earlier on, and I think it's one of the most interesting dynamics of all of this, the sort of changing balance of power in the relationship between Moscow and Beijing, and Putin and Xi particularly. And we were talking about that 3 or 4 years ago in the sort of UK government, and indeed I was sent on a series of trips to Tbilisi, Baku, Astana, Ulaanbaatar even, and Tashkent, just to start sort of seeing whether a lack of Russian interest in Central Asia, whilst they were distracted with Ukraine, was an opportunity for us. David Cameron followed on into the region, so did James Cleverly, who were the UK Foreign Secretaries at the time. And I remember CENTCOM thinking about the same, was there an opportunity for the US to take advantage of Russia being distracted, and also in the same process to provide a bit more of a 360 challenge to China from Central Asia. But I fear, John, that what has happened is rather than the US and Europe being able to make ground in Central Asia at the Russian expense, it's China who have made huge ground in Central Asia at the Russian expense. And people even talk to me about growing Chinese ownership of assets and infrastructure in Siberia too. What does all this mean? And is this real strategic jeopardy for Putin, or is it just irrelevant in the political discussions in Moscow?
I don't think it's completely irrelevant. It's not sort of publicly discussed. I mean, we don't see it in the media, for example. But it's very clear to the ruling class that a choice has been made here. That in a sense, the window to the west, opened by Peter the Great, 300 plus years ago, that's now closed. How long it will remain closed, we will have to see. I certainly believe that when Putin does finally leave the scene, that there will be possibly a quite radical readjustment of Russian foreign policy. I don't see how Russia can continue down this path of just making itself subservient to China, because as much as that relationship between Russia and China may be warm at the level of the two presidents, in actual fact there are quite a few problems underneath the surface that are historical and territorial issues, various frictions also in economic relations. But for the moment, they're both useful to each other, and in fact, Russia very much relies on Chinese support. It would not be fighting this war as it is today without Chinese support. That's abundantly clear. So how might this all develop? I think you're right. In Central Asia, my sense is the Russians have lost ground. Also, you can see it in the Caucasus, in the case of most perhaps dramatically of Azerbaijan, where Turkey has now much greater influence, and there's a prospect even of some peace agreement even between Azerbaijan and Armenia, because they both sense that the Russians are sort of on the run here. So you've got some possibly reordering of relations there. Trump had the 5 Central Asian leaders in the White House, a couple of weeks ago. And I wouldn't read too much into that, but it was still interesting that they bothered to turn up, because they want diversification in their relations. But if you think of the virtual elimination of USAID's programs in Central Asia and that sort of wider region, then who's filling the vacuum? As I understand it, it's the Chinese. So they're very careful not to step on Russia's toes in terms of regional security, but in economic relations, obviously, they're becoming the sort of dominant force. And over time, they may exert sort of greater pull on certain regions of Russia, but they don't seem to be in a hurry, I think, to assume that role. And they have good reason not to want Russia to be defeated in this war, to become sort of, some sort of basket case. I mean, they already have to deal with North Korea, for goodness sake.
Yeah.
So I suspect they think that Russia can tough this out. It's not pretty. I don't think, also the Chinese, personally, I don't think they want to see Ukraine defeated, because they realize that just how damaging this would be for Europe and the European market. They also have an interest in the reconstruction of Ukraine. So I think their view is that, well, yes, we maintain our relations with Russia, we supply them with certain things, but we also supply the Ukrainians with certain things. So it's not our war, it's your problem, so don't rely on us to sort this out for you. So the interesting question, nevertheless, is, are we going to get to the point where, for example, and this is absolutely counterintuitive thought, but I don't think it should be disregarded, because I hear some mutterings from Moscow that people have even started to think about this, that if Xi and Trump were to find some common language around Russia and ending this war in Ukraine, then that could make the Russians very uncomfortable. And the fact that when Trump and Xi met a couple of weeks ago in South Korea, the issue of Ukraine was on the agenda. I believe it was discussed, but only very briefly. And there, Xi said that we're going to continue buying Russian oil. Sorry, because we need it. But that was enough, I think, to maybe unnerve some people in the Kremlin, and with their conspiratorial mindset, lead them to believe that maybe some understanding might be found between Washington and Beijing.
Really interesting. John, just finally, because we love a little bit of salacious gossip on superpowers, Lavrov seems to have disappeared. He's probably been in post even longer than you've been studying the region. Has he finally sort of got his wish and been allowed to retire, or has he done something wrong and been removed, or is this just he's on holiday somewhere?
I don't think it's probably any of those, James, actually. You're right, he's been there since 2004, and he is, I think, widely regarded as an extremely competent foreign minister, fantastic intellect, extraordinary ability to manipulate facts, but above all, total loyalty to Putin, and prepared to lie at every turn if needed, and of course he's lost credibility as a result. So when he disappeared from a Security Council meeting, would have been just over 2 weeks ago, there was a lot of speculation that this had coincided with the sort of collapse of the US, Russia peace talks. He'd had a conversation with Marco Rubio, the US Secretary of State, that went obviously badly. And Rubio then told Trump there's no point meeting with Putin because you're not going to get anything out of it. But all that Lavrov could possibly have been doing was to repeat the message from Putin, because he wouldn't do anything else.
Yeah.
He's not authorized to do that. He will be 76 in March next year. So he hasn't been in post as long as Andrei Gromyko back in the Soviet days, so I think took office in the 1950s and served into the 80s. Hasn't quite competed with that. But he's probably, on the way out. I suspect it was a minor health issue or something that kept him out of the meetings. He's also not heading the G20 delegation going to South Africa, and people interpreted that also as a fact that he may have fallen into disfavour. But he popped up again last week, and he came up with the usual messages that Zelensky's a Nazi, and all this sort of stuff that showed that nothing had really changed. So I wouldn't read too much into it, other than that, like Putin and that group, Putin's foreign policy advisor in the Kremlin, Yuri Ushakov, is 78. These people are aging; they can't carry on forever. But the question does arise of, why hasn't Lavrov been allowed to retire? He might have reasonably expected to do so a few years ago. But I think he's just been asked to carry on and told it's his patriotic duty. And in some respects, or at least for Putin's purposes, he's quite effective. The message he takes to the global south, for example, I think lands on often quite fertile ground.
Yes.
He's very good at contradicting the Western narratives, of picking holes in them. You may remember Liz Truss going to Moscow as Foreign Secretary, and he immediately bowled her some sort of googly that she misread, and then came up with the wrong response. And he just showed he's got that sort of mastery of dealing with people who don't have his degree of experience. He knows the detail.
I remember it well, and indeed I was an active participant in that game of cat and mouse, competing for narratives all over the global south, and it was interesting. I passionately believe that he's wrong and we're right in what we're saying, and that the global south interest is far better served by aligning with countries that are liberal, democratic, and economically liberalized and want to trade on fair terms. But he was amazing at pointing to CNN, which would be invariably on in the office of whichever foreign minister you were talking to, and point to the truckers in Canada, or the Gilets jaunes in France, or the BLM protests in the UK and the US, and he'd sort of say, is that what you want? And he would sort of point out a whole load of what he would regard as hypocrisies in Western foreign policy, and inconsistencies in the way that we do our politics at home, and the way that we deal with various sections of our public discourse. and it was like striking at shadows. The whataboutery was endless, but it was incredibly persuasive. So in some ways, I'm disappointed to hear you say that Lavrov is still on the scene, because it would be good news for the West if he weren't. But there we go.
Yeah, he will be, James. He will be hard to replace.
Yeah.
That's for sure, and that may be the reason why he's still there. But he's an interesting example, because when he was appointed foreign minister in 2004, within the Russian foreign ministry at the time, he was regarded as intellectual, cultured, polite to everybody, had a very good reputation in that respect, and really an outstanding diplomat. Because his job still at that stage, I think, was to build positive relations with the West. But as soon as the task became one, in fact, of effectively dismantling those relations, and being aggressive, he showed that he could do whatever was required of him. And to think what Lavrov was like over 20 years ago is sort of really quite hard just to imagine right now. And that's again, I think he's a potent symbol of just how Russia has changed over those 2 decades.
He is sad. John, thank you very much indeed. John Lough is the head of foreign policy at the new Eurasian Strategies Centre. You've been watching Superpowers, the future of global security, here on Times Radio. For more of Times Radio's amazing geopolitical content, please make sure that you subscribe to the channel. For now, I'm James Heappey. See you for more Superpowers next week.